Yo, what's going on, everybody? I thought I'd jump on and make a quick video because this really caught my eye. It was quite interesting. We got some news yesterday from a Mark Rosewater article talking about the future of Limited and the design philosophies they have going forward now that play boosters are a thing. We got some hints of what that could mean with Karlov Manor, but he specifies in this article that the things in this article are not going to be put into effect with this set, with the next set. It's the way they are designing sets in the building, at the Wizards building today, that we'll see the effects of in probably about a year. Before we get in, I just want to say there's a lot of positives here. I think, just for myself, there's a lot of things that Mark covers here that I was really hoping for would be true about Limited going forward. And there's a lot of, I think, hints towards things that are kind of looking to fix some of the things that people don't like as much about Limited right now. So let's just jump into this. So he starts off the article talking about some things that we kind of already knew, talking about how play boosters have 20 fewer commons than draft boosters did, and that gets donated to the uncommon slot, where there are now 100 different uncommons in the set. And what that means is that every common has to be a bit more impactful, has to have a place. They're really going to try to make commons not be junky. They're going to have commons, every single common has a place in the format. We're not going to be seeing like demolish level cards anymore, or cards that just like never got picked, never got played in the limited format, which I think is good. I feel like in Karlov Manor even so far, it's definitely very true. There are very few just junky commons. Every common has a place somewhere. Some of them are more generically good. Some of them are more just like, okay, like this isn't going to go in every deck, but it does go in some deck. And I think that's a good goal to strive for. The rest of the article, though, is where it gets really interesting, because this is the stuff that we didn't really know before. So what he does here is he goes through color by color, talking about what has changed or what is going to change going from the draft boosters to the play boosters. And as you can see here, he's kind of got like design skeletons for each of the colors. So in the draft boosters, you'd have these things. And of course, because there's fewer commons, some of those things are going to be cut out. And I am going to post this article in the description if you want to follow along. I'm not going to go through every single detail, but if you're interested in kind of the design side of things, I would recommend checking it out. I'm just going to talk about the most important things, though. And one of the first most important things he talks about is that the traditional sideboard cards, like Naturalize or Disenchant, they're going to be a bit more modal. They're going to be a bit more main deckable now. And we already kind of saw that with Make Your Move in Karlov Manor. And I think it's a really good thing, because you still kind of get the sideboard effect of, okay, I can draft this card for my sideboard, but you could main deck it if you really wanted to or needed to. Make Your Move is a really good example where that card, sometimes made my main deck. I would say when I'm drafting white, like 20% of the time, I was just short a 23rd playable. I was like, yeah, okay, I'll throw that in. But out of the board, you still get that effect of like, oh yeah, it's going to be really, really good against this opponent. This is going to really be an upgrade over the worst card in my deck. So we're not really losing out on the sideboard nature of things, while at the same time making these cards a bit more flexible, a bit less just like end of the pack junky stuff. And I think this is definitely a bit of a nod to best of one. So you have cards that are good in your best of one decks, because sideboard cards don't really get played in best of one, of course. And again, this is all just in an effort to make sure that all of the commons in each pack are going to be cards that people want to put in their deck. The next thing I thought is really interesting that he talks about here is they're going to move away from pacifism style effects and move towards banishing light effects. And this is something I have been hoping for a very long time, because they had kind of got it right in the past little while. They really had to push the pacifisms to make them like 2 mana, the creature can't attack and block, can't activate abilities, right? Like, really had to make them really push, because generally these cards are not very powerful anymore. They used to be really good cards back in the day, but the problem was that these cards just weren't good enough at dealing with the threats you needed to deal with, because a lot of creatures these days have good activated abilities or passive abilities, right? Even the best of these kind of cards didn't turn off passive abilities. And they're moving to stuff like Banishing Light. We already saw in Karlov Manor, we saw Makeshift Binding, and that's a pretty good variant on that. So we're going to get a little more of that kind of stuff, get things off the battlefield, which I really feel like was kind of needed. One thing he notes here is that there's certain non-creature effects that won't always make it into the design file. So something like a Go Wide Team Pump effect. And the fix for that he mentioned is those are now going to be on creatures a little more often. So if they want a team pump effect, it's not going to be in the spell slot, it's going to be in the creature slot. It kind of makes it so that whatever that slot is, whatever that card is taken up by, it fills a dual purpose. It could just be a creature you put in your deck and it's fine, but if your deck is really going wide, you're going to really want to prioritize that card. Moving on to blue now, he notes that there is no longer a default 1-drop in blue at common, and potentially multiple 6-drops, which is kind of interesting. But the 1-drop thing, that's what I was talking about, where I think we're getting hints of, they get the sense that a lot of players are like, oh, the 1-drop's like the curve always starts on 1. We're going to see it come back a little bit later too. So I think they're going to move the 1-drops up to uncommon. So you have those just nutty starts a little bit less often. And it's interesting to me, too, that multiple 6-drops. We'll see where they go with that. Also notes that Vigilance is very much in Blue's wheelhouse now. They like it as an ability to help you attack, but still be able to defend. Makes a lot of sense in Blue. We've seen a little bit of that in the past year. And then moving to Blue's interaction spells, he notes that just like with the pacifism thing, where you really kind of have to have removal spells these days that get rid of abilities or get something off the battlefield for good, they're looking to move more towards the kind of witness protection kind of interaction spell, or at least spells that overwrite abilities and text boxes. I think this is also a pretty positive change. Blue's kind of aura-based removal spells have not been so good in, well, I mean, almost ever, basically. And I'm really interested to see where they go with this in particular, because with the pacifism to banishing light thing, like, that's a pretty clean transition. But with this one, like, the problem with these cards is that they still leave a 1/1 on the battlefield, and that's a piece of material that they can trump block with, they can gang up into double block, they can sacrifice. Like, these cards still are not great. Like, this doesn't solve the problem as much as going from pacifism to banishing light does. So I imagine what they'll do is they'll pump up what you actually get out. So maybe it'll be like witness protection, but you also get to scry one. Or maybe they'll make it more expensive and actually tap down the creature. So it'll be like a 3 mana, that thing doesn't untap and it loses all abilities. Like, that would be a fine solve for that too, because at least you can't get into combat. And he also mentions that with more rares and mythics running around, they do want good answers in all colors to those rares and mythics. That makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be in those spots where it's like, oh look, my removal spell doesn't actually kill the thing it needs to. Why did I put this card in my deck? You know? And then we have black, which I think is actually the least changed color. There's really not too much that looks like it's new, that they're really jumping off the deep end being like, oh, we're trying something else new here. It does note that there will be more common creatures, which I think is good, going from 52% of the commons being creatures to 62% of the commons in black being creatures. It's got a breakdown here of like the kind of spells you're going to see. So small conditional removal spell, combat trick, card draw with an added cost, you know, losing life. Coercion, this is one that's interesting. Noting that moving away from just like mind rots or just, you know, the discard effect that they'll usually pick will be a coercion, one that looks at your opponent's hand, you get to pick one. Again, kind of a response to there being more rares and mythics in the set, so that's kind of nice. And just like white, they're kind of trimming some of the fat of the non-creature spells, going to be putting those effects on like enter the battlefield effects for creatures. Moving on to red now, he notes that there will be more menace, because they like how menace plays. And I actually like how menace plays too. It makes some interesting combat situations, so that's just like something small of note. Also notes that there will always be a dedicated reach slot at the common slot for making sure you can block rares and mythics, which is interesting because the rares and mythics are more likely to have flying, he mentions, which I think is something that is probably true, although I don't know how much like just a random reach creature is actually going to help you get some mythic rare, but we'll see. Also, not as much first strike anymore, which I think is something we've seen over the past 10 years, just them slowly having less and less first strike. More first strike on my turn, because if you have just a bunch of first strike creatures, your opponent can never attack into you, so that makes a lot of sense. That kind of just seems like the way they were going anyways. But red's biggest change here, two biggest changes, are that it no longer has a guaranteed 1-drop slot and instead has a guaranteed 6-drop slot. So again, going back to not as many 1-drops at common, this one actually surprised me. Like, blue losing out on its 1-drop, okay, that makes sense. Like, the blue decks didn't really like care for the 1-drop all that much, but actually making a conscious design choice to say there will no longer be a guaranteed 1-drop in red. That says something to me, right? That really says like we have a goal in mind, that we want the games not to always start on turn 1, and giving maybe an enticing 6-drop, like a reason to play a bit of a longer game in your red decks. I think that's pretty cool. Going hand in hand with that, he mentions that there will always be a card filtering slot in red, either like a rummaging thing, like a, you know, tormenting voice style card, or an impulse draw kind of card, like a reckless impulse. And the big red removal spells will start going from 5 damage, like we usually see, to 6 to deal with more rares and mythics. That's a pretty easy change. I don't really think that affects too much, but will be just like a kind of nice quality of life improvement. I imagine that removal spell is still going to be kind of on the clunkier side, but just being able to go, okay, well, I'm going to put this clunky removal spell in my deck. At least I want to be able to kill the big things when they come down. And then with green here, this is another one that I was really hoping they'd put into practice. I'd been thinking this for a while, but green has gone from having 1 removal spell, either a fight or a bite. You know, the fights being the ones that the creatures deal damage to each other, the bites being the ones where your creature deals the damage, they don't deal the damage back. Now, it's going to be a fight and a bite. So not only does this give green a little bit more interaction, but a guaranteed bite is really nice, because there's been a lot of sets, not as many in the past, like 4 or 5 sets, but, you know, previous to that, where the green removal spell was a fight, and unless it was like an exceptional fight spell, it just kind of sucked, and you never really played it, and you never really wanted to play it. Like, when fighting was first introduced, green's creatures generally were a lot bigger than your opponent's white or red or blue creatures. Now that creature sizing has kind of caught up to green in a lot of ways, where cheap creatures are now a bit bigger stat-wise, green's fights didn't always do the thing you needed them to do. So just having a guaranteed bite spell and a fight spell is kind of like the secondary removal spell if you need it. I think that's a really welcome change in my books. And the second thing with green here, which I think is a good thing, but I know a lot of people who like to draft multicolor decks might not see it as such. I think so far we've kind of seen just across the board positives, but this one might, ruffle some feathers. So basically the idea here is they're going to be moving away from green's spells fixing your mana as easily, and moving a little bit more towards them just making green mana so they ramp you but not fix you. And the idea here is with more rares running around the pack, you don't want green to just turn into, well, this is the color that I just play all the rares and mythics. Now, there will still be fixing. It's not like there's not going to be fixing. They're just going to make, for example, the common mana producing creature make green a little more often rather than making a mana of any color. And by the way, all this design skeleton stuff, it's not like every single set's going to be exactly like this. It's just kind of some principles, some baselines they're going off of. I'm sure we're going to see sets with dual lands at commons, and there will be a green mana creature that fixes for all your colors. It's just a little bit of a tweak in one direction. And then to close out the article, he talks about multicolor and talks about artifacts. And I'm not going to get into the artifact stuff. Again, you can read this on your own if you'd like. But the one interesting thing with multicolor is now it's going to be the norm where there are 2 signpost uncommons for each color pair. One of them is going to be a payoff for whatever the deck's doing. One of them is going to be an enabler. I really like that too. And he said where there's been 2 uncommons, kind of feels like you're getting a little more rewarded for being in the right lane. And, just like gold cards are generally fun, right? They're usually powerful. They're usually like fun to read, fun to play. So I think that's a pretty nice change too. And then just lastly, he does have some final closing thoughts. And I have some final closing thoughts I want to share too. But just to pick out some of them, he says, with all the rares and mythics running around, the synergy of draft themes is more important than ever. We want to encourage you to play the themes rather than just play a smattering of bombs, which I think is a good change. I think that nobody would argue that that's a bad change. Also says we want to make sure there's enough graveyard hate so that mythics and rare threats aren't continually coming back. It's also a good thing. If you played Theros Beyond Death, you'll know that was definitely something that was quite annoying about that format. Here's a good one. Rares and mythics will be more liberal in their use of extra pips of colored mana to make them harder to splash. And I think we already saw that with one of the best rares in Murders being Ezram, being a white, blue card. Although, props to them with Ezram, slops to them with Izoni, which, by the way, last time we saw Izoni was like a black, green card. I think that one also, this time around, could have been like 2 black, green, but, that's beside the point. But I think that they are going to be more conscious of that going forward so that people don't just, like, splash all these amazing rares going around. And also, this is something that's come up, not as often, but occasionally. It's important to make sure that some portion of the rares and mythics play into the draft themes. And that's something that I've definitely felt in certain sets they've been a little bit light on, where the rares are a little bit more focused on commander, a little more focused on constructed, weird build around. So just kind of nice overall for us limited players. My final thoughts on this are just that I think ideally where they end up with the common designs is that every single card in the pack matters, like they've kind of said that it does, but you're not just like, oh, everything's a banger, everything's a great card, that's a good, white's open, the white cards are coming to me, I take those. I do think you're going to have some number of cards that are just like, yes, that's an excellent card no matter what. Novice Inspector, for example, although maybe not as extreme as Novice Inspector, but most of the cards, most of the commons are like C to C minus level commons that then in the right deck become C pluses or B minuses, right? So you're still drafting with synergy, but you don't just end up in a spot where it's like, well, these cards only go in this deck and I'm not in that deck, so I can't take them even though it's in my colors, right? I think that's kind of an experience they want to avoid while still being able to go, hey, if I know how to draft this deck properly, I'm taking all the exact right cards for it and I get rewarded. So anyways, yeah, I just kind of wanted to share this. I thought it was interesting. And of course, let me know your thoughts on this. If there's anything that you don't like from these changes, if there's something that you hope they change going forward. And yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.